And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and implored him. Another translation says, begged him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy left him. You see, I didn't really understand this most of my life, but why was this such a big deal? Well, this was such a big deal because when you understand how people viewed leprosy, that most people viewed men and women with leprosy as cursed, as less than, it's insignificant, as a throwaway. And out of the 61 defilements of the ancient Jewish laws, interacting with someone with leprosy was number 2. Do you know the only thing that was worse? Interacting with a dead body. So this is a really freaking big deal. When Jesus is going through a town, and there's a man that is begging Jesus, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And I don't think that he was just saying it. I think he was probably screaming it or yelling it. Why? Because Jesus is going through a town, and the guess is that there was a multitude around him. Plus, if you had leprosy, you would have to be at least 6 feet away from other people. And if it was a windy day, you would have to be 100 feet away from people. And this is like before COVID, guys. And if you had leprosy, you would have to walk around before you would get to someone saying, leprosy, 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 or unclean, 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 so that you would avoid people and they would avoid you. So when Jesus is walking through a town with so many people following him, excited, being like, dang, this dude's going to perform a miracle. Let's see what he does next. And then this man's crying out, screaming out, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And I love it. He doesn't say if you can. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And, the Bible doesn't make this clear, and this is just what I believe. I don't believe that man was close to Jesus. I believe Jesus had to cover the ground to get close to him. And yes, Jesus could have done go-go gadget arms and touched him. But I don't think that was the case. I think Jesus probably started to walk over to that man. And we know that this man is either on his knees or he's on all fours or he's face down to the ground. You don't know exactly, but my guess is that he was probably laying down. And my guess is when Jesus was walking over to him, there was probably a lot of voices, maybe even some of the disciples, that were saying, bro, what are you doing? No. Do you understand what you can't? He has leprosy. Do you understand that that's a defilement? Bro, you can't go over there. Don't touch him. And you can only imagine what a lot of the people were saying and thinking, what is he doing? What are you doing? Do you know who you're going to see? Do you know who you're walking towards? Like, you talk about countercultural. Jesus is walking to the people, to the person that most people think is disgusting. But not to Jesus. No. He loves this man. He covers the ground to him, and the Bible doesn't make this clear, but when this man's lying down, and the Bible does tell us that he reaches out and touches him. So my guess is that Jesus probably bent over, put his hand on him. See, what did he do first? He didn't tell him, yes, I'm willing. He showed him in front of everybody, yes, I'm willing. And then he tells him, I am willing. Be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. You see, I just my guess, but I bet you when some of the disciples and some of the people were there and they were listening. They were like, wow, Jesus is pretty willing. I feel pretty willing. Dude, he's willing to come over here and touch a dude with leprosy. Like, man, he kind of likes people, like. But I bet they didn't fully grasp until some of those same people could have also been there on Golgotha. And man, could you imagine when they're watching Christ being crucified and they're like, man, I remember when he covered the ground to go touch that man with leprosy. When everybody was saying, but bro, don't go, what are you doing? When everybody else just looked past that man, Jesus didn't. And then, hey, do you remember when Jesus said, he said, yes, I'm willing. Oh, man, we had no idea what he meant. We had no idea how willing he really was till now. You see, when we understand the gospel, we understand that we serve the King and King Jesus that was willing to go to the cross to take on the sins of the world for me. That I nailed Jesus to the cross. When I was in high school, I was in the Philippines on a mission trip, and I had the opportunity to go to a prison with one of my older brothers, and we walked into this prison, and on the prison like chalkboard thing before you walk in, it has what everybody has done, and it was rape, murder, homicide, rape, all the way down. And I was like trying to act tough and not scared, but that's just not accurate. But my oldest brother, my middle brother, Peter, was walking in, and he was like, it was no big deal to him. So I was like, shoot, I can't like be a coward. I got it. And so Peter walks in, I walk in right behind him. So and he walks right in, and it's just a concrete block. It's not like what you'd think of with cells here. It's just literally a concrete block, and all of these men are packed into it. And so we walk in, and Peter walks all the way to the backside, and even the COs weren't even walking there. And so Peter walks all the way into the back, and so I walk all the way into the back, and there's a 5-gallon bucket. I flip it over, and I sit on it, and Peter stands up and starts preaching, and he gets to the cross. And he looks at all of these inmates, and he says, hey, look at me, guys. I just want you to know. I want all of you to know. I nailed Jesus to the cross. And I look up, and I was like, bro, what are you talking about? No, you didn't. If anybody did, they did. And I just knew that God was pricking my heart. And he was saying, no, Timmy. You did. You did. The gospel is personal. My sin nailed Jesus to the cross. But that's the King that I also get to serve, is a King that loves me so much that said, yes, I know you've screwed up, but I love you so much that I'll be the ransom, I'll be the propitiation, I'll be the payment that satisfies. I'm going to go in your place. That's the gospel. That's the King that we serve. That's how willing he was for us. Alexander the Great is known as Alexander the Great. I don't even know how else to explain it to you. To explain it as Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great took a few of his soldiers and he marched to a fortified city. And he told the king, come down here and talk to me. So the opposing king came down there with some of the soldiers and talked to him. And Alexander the Great said, hey, I want you and all of your people to surrender. Obviously, I'm sort of paraphrasing this. And the opposing king said, like, no. You are literally no threat to us. You have a few, your army's not even here. You have a few soldiers. Why would we surrender to you? And he said, let me give you a demonstration. With all the people watching from the city walls, and the king watching, and even some of his soldiers there watching, he told his men to line up in a single file line and start walking, and they did. Right to a cliff. And one by one, they walked off the edge of their cliff and fell to their death. Until 10 of his men had walked off the edge of the cliff. And then he said, stop. The rest of you come back and stand by me. And they all ran back and stood by Alexander the Great. The opposing king shook, terrified. All the people watched from the city walls, terrified. And the opposing king instantly surrendered to Alexander the Great. Because he thought, man, if he was willing to sacrifice his men as a point, what will he be willing to do when all of his army shows up? So I don't even know how to explain to you. I don't even know how to tell you another way to describe Alexander the Great. But that's not the best title. But do you know who the great king is? It's King Jesus. Because when King Jesus, when it is our fault, it was our fault, it is my fault. He didn't sacrifice us. He said, no, I love you. I'm going to go. I love you so much. No, it's opposite of Alexander the Great. How willing was our king? He said, no, I love you so much. Our king took our place. Our king went, so we didn't have to. But I would challenge all of us, myself first. What are we really willing to do? Are we willing to go to hard places? Are we willing to cover the ground, even for the people that maybe most don't like, or don't understand, or have walked past, or have looked beyond, or have forgotten? Would we not look past? Would we not forget? Would we not walk by those that maybe the rest of the world does? One of the reasons that my dad is one of my greatest heroes and role models is my dad's just not someone that can look the other way. He's not someone that sees it and doesn't step up to do something. And gosh, I don't know, it's 13 years ago, 14, I don't know, something like that. My dad was on a mission trip at a pastor's conference, and it was a country where faith isn't allowed. And so they were having an underground pastors conference so these pastors don't get arrested and they can go back to their communities and share the gospel. And because they're in an underground location, other things would take place there. And there was these men that brought in 4 little girls, and they started to auction off the little girls for sale for really bad things. And my dad, why he's such a hero, is he can't just do nothing. And so he takes out all the money in his wallet, which was $1,250, and he was able to purchase the freedom of these 4 girls. And that night, my dad gave me a call. And I picked up the phone and I said, hey, Dad. He said, hey, son, how you doing? I said, great, Dad. How's the trip going? He's like, oh, it's pretty good. I said, what are you up to? He's like, I just purchased the freedom of 4 girls. That's not like a normal Monday night conversation. You know? I was like, oh, that's cool, Dad. And I said, Dad, so what did the rest of the pastors do with? How, did they step up, or are they being able to house the girls or feed them? Did the rest of the pastors, what did they do? Nothing. one of them. Not one of them said, hey, Mr. Tebow, let me go find the first night, a place they can stay. Let me go find some food. Let me go figure out the next home. Let me go figure out the next steps. And do you know why? Because they all had a really, really good excuse. Just like I do so many days of my life, I find really, really good excuses. Do you know what their excuse was? It's a good one. Well, if I raise my hand and I help Mr. Tebow and I am a part of this, then, they could use that money to go do other really bad things. Very true, for sure. But go say that to those 4 girls. And how many times do we find a really, really good excuse? Man, all the time. I feel like it's something we see in Scripture all the time. Really, really good excuses. We see the Good Samaritan. What's happened? This man that is beaten and left for dead, and most people believe it was a Jewish man. What happens? A priest goes by. What does he have? Really, really good excuses. Well, I know he's beaten and left for dead, but maybe he's dead. And if I go over there and I touch him, then I just defiled myself. I have to literally go all the way back, and I have to go through a 7-day ritual to therefore become unclean, or before become clean again, because I would be unclean by touching a dead body. Or if I go over there and I see him, well, guess what? The same people could be waiting for me. And I could get jumped. That's not good either. So there's a lot of really, really good excuses. And Levi shows up, a temple assistant. He also would have known a lot of Scripture, though, and he has some good excuses. Well, the priest didn't stop. That's sort of like my boss. My boss doesn't stop. I don't have to stop. Plus, I also don't want to get jumped either. So he has really, really good excuses. But then the Samaritan shows up. The Samaritan has so many reasons to keep going. He has cultural reasons to keep going. Race reasons to keep going. Threat reasons to keep going. But he doesn't. He goes and he meets the needs. Would we be men and women that don't find the best excuses, but would we find every reason to stay? Would we find every reason to give? I would encourage all of us that there's a really big difference between caring and calling. A lot of people show up and really, really care. And then some show up and they're really, really called. But you know what happens when you show up and you care and you get a bloody nose? Well, pretty soon you go care about something else. But I love what I believe is the best definition for calling: an urgent divine invitation to accept responsibility for a particular task. Urgent and divine invitation to accept responsibility for a particular task. Doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. It's my responsibility. It's your responsibility. And it's also urgent. Would we be men and women that don't just care, but that are called? Would we be men and women that are willing to go to the hard places because we know that Jesus did for us? And we not stop when it gets really, really hard? Would we share an honest, accurate picture of the gospel? Would we go to hard places? Would we not make excuses? And would we be willing to show up to heaven exhausted, not well rested. A massive fear for me is to show up to heaven being super well rested. And man, we get there and be like, oh, this is going to be awesome. Like, man, I'm ready. God, I'm ready to go. And he's like, God, I had all of those good works in store for you to do. You knew Ephesians 2:10. You knew that in Christ you are a masterpiece, a workmanship created for good works, which I prepared beforehand. But why weren't you running after them? And I don't want to get to heaven and be well rested. Listen, I know that rest is biblical, but so is running. And I love the Greek, it's treho. And I love the best definition for this Greek word treho. We get run. It means to advance speedily, like an athlete moving forward with full effort and a directed purpose. We get to advance speedily, just like an athlete, but with a more important purpose. That purpose is hurting people. That purpose is the Great Commission. That purpose is what we are called to go bring to the world. And it's our responsibility. That's mine. And it's yours. But would we be willing to say yes to that calling? A pastor in southern India named Dr. Thomas, quite a few years ago, was called one day to go to northern India, where for Christians there was a lot more persecution, and he felt called to go to a 5-day crusade there in northern India. And he was already leading a little over 100 churches in southern India, and him and a few members of his team and his son Samuel went to northern India to try to have a 5-day crusade. And the first night they had around 250 people, the next night a few more, the next night a few more. Night 4 they had just under 800 people. And then the next morning, Dr. Thomas felt like God was putting on his heart, I need to tonight put out 5,000 chairs. And he tells his son, hey, we need to go put out 5,000 chairs. And his son's like, Dad, the son just thinks he knows a little bit better. He's like, Dad, stewardship matters, and each chair is 30 cents. Like, Dad, no. He's like, do you not believe, son? He gets a call from one of his friends, and Dr. Thomas says, hey, how you doing? His friend says, good. Is there anything that you need? Dr. Thomas says, yes, we need 10,000 chairs, but 5,000 will do. He said, I got you. They'll be there tonight, 5,000 chairs. A little bit later in the afternoon, there's 5,000 chairs in an open alleyway. All the chairs are there, but no one has showed up. It's about that time, and so Dr. Thomas gathers up a small team, and he says, Samuel, would you pray? And Samuel prays, and right after he prays, it starts to pour. And Samuel's like, of course. And he's like, Dad, what do you want to do? Like, what should we do? It's pouring. No one's here. I said, tell the choir to go start to sing. He's like, Dad, for real? Samuel, please tell the choir. Samuel goes and tells the choir. The choir goes to sing. Samuel goes back to his dad. Dad, what do you want to do? There's nobody here. Dr. Thomas. I know. Choir finishes. Dad, what are you going to do? Dr. Thomas walks out there and he preaches for 50 minutes to a congregation of none. And even some of his own team were in the back making fun of him. And then after preaching for 50 minutes, he starts to give an invitation for another 5 minutes or so, inviting all of these nobody people to accept Christ. And he finishes, and he's soaked. He's waterlogged. He'd been out there for over 55 minutes preaching his heart out, and he's soaked. And he walks back and he gets in the car, and Samuel's already in the car. When he gets in the car, Samuel looks at his dad and he said, "Are you satisfied?" And Dr. Thomas says, "This has nothing to do with being satisfied, Samuel. It has everything to do with, did I do what the Lord was asking me to do?" Years later, Dr. Thomas had a stroke, and he was in the hospital. He only had a few days left before he was going to heaven. And the nurse comes in and says, "You guys have a visitor, Samuel. Do you want me to say yes to this visitor?" Samuel's like, "Sure, you can let him in." So he let in this man who comes in, and he takes off his sandals and puts them to the side, and he lays face down with tears flowing down his face. He says, "Dr. Thomas, you don't know me. But years ago, I was a senior, and I was a physics student. And life wasn't going the way I wanted. And I decided I'm going to kill myself. So I left the school, and I was walking, and it started to pour. And so I sat down under a mango tree. And then I heard from a distance this man start to talk. And I looked over because he was talking with such passion, with such urgency, with such love for what he was talking about. I had to listen. Then I saw in the distance he was talking to nobody. So I thought, man, if he cares that much, I gotta pay attention. And I sat there for an hour. And then this man gave an invitation to say yes to Jesus. And that day I did. I said yes. When you invited people to say yes to Jesus, I did that day. And then I went home and I was disowned. And then a Christian family took me in, paid my way through college. And now I'm a pastor of a congregation of 67 people. And at this point, Dr. Thomas couldn't speak. But with tears flowing down his face, he looked up to his son. He didn't look at the man. He looked up to his son. And he gave him a thumbs up. And because he showed up, because his faithfulness, even when his own team is making fun of him, even when they're saying, "What are you doing? It's pouring, there's nobody here." Why would you tell nobody? Because he was saying yes to what God called him to do. Even though everybody else was making fun of him. Even though his son didn't understand. But now his son is leading a ministry that is massively impacting so many boys and girls. Now this man who he didn't even know he's talking to is now a pastor of a church. The ripple effects because he said yes. Because because he wasn't worried about what are other people going to say, what are the results. The results are God. But answering the call with effort and urgency, that's your choice. That's my choice. How many days have I made the wrong one? Oh man, I was just too worried about what people are going to say. Oh, I just thought, well, there's not going to be any results. So I know better. But would we be men and women that would say, yes, God, I just want to do what you want me to do. I just want to do what you want me to do. Not long ago, there was an incredible man that had the opportunity to come from Africa to America to meet with some of the most powerful people in the world, to influence them in the right way. And years ago, this man, when he was a boy, was a throwaway. He was treated as nothing. But there was one family in Texas that was invited to care for this boy from afar. And they were told, if you were willing to give $30 a month, you could care for this boy. And they didn't have a lot of money, and they thought, man, it's going to be really difficult, but he's so worth it. We're going to find a way to do it. We're going to find a way to do it. So every month they did it. They did it. And this throwaway, he grew up to now influence many of the most important people in the world. But what he does every day is he rescues boys and girls from some of the worst evils in the world. And not long ago, after that meeting with some of the most powerful people in our country and in the world, he had the opportunity to go and see the family that gave him a chance. And I didn't get the chance to go, but I knew it was happening, and I wanted to be there. I couldn't be there when it happened. But it was just such an impactful thought, because man, how special was that moment when he got to walk up to this family that believed in him, that found a way every month to care for him, to give him a chance, even though they never met him until that moment. Even though they never saw him in person, even though they had no idea what was going to happen in the future, they had no idea the results. They had no idea that he was going to turn into an incredible hero. And I mean that. I don't say that lightly. An incredible hero. But they were willing to give anyways. And because of their giving and God's faithfulness, this man is radically impacting the world. And then imagine that moment when they get to say yes to him in person and open their arms and give him a hug. Could you imagine what that moment was like? I've heard a lot about it, but I wish I could have seen it with my own eyes. Because they showed up, his life was different, but because they showed up, multitudes are different. Because you showed up, whose life is different. But man, I believe when you show up, we serve a God that also shows up. And man, I can only imagine one day for you what that moment's going to be like because of your giving. And I mean that with your words. I mean that with your finances. I mean that with your effort. I mean that with your prayers. I mean that with your life. I mean that with your hands. I mean that with your effort. Because you showed up, what will that moment be like at the end of your life, or maybe in heaven? When God's like, hey, I want you to meet this family because you gave, because you prayed, because you showed up, because you shared with them my love for them. Look, they're here. Because you showed up, whose life will be different. When we be men and women that don't know the results, but know who's asking. We know who's asking. King Jesus. And would we say yes? I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know it all. This past summer, we got to be in Corinth, and it was so cool because you're reading Corinthians, and then you're there, and you're like, dang, this is so coming together because you're reading what Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians 13. I don't mean the whole love part. I mean after that when he's saying, for now we see through a mirror dimly. And like most of the time I just didn't really understand that. But when you get to Corinth, you understand it because the city of Corinth was known for its mirrors. Except actually most of the Christians, most of them probably had really bad mirrors. And so many of them their mirrors were out of metals, many out of bronze. And many times they're not like good mirrors. It's not like, my wife's mirrors where she's like, oh, doing all of her makeup and hair and stuff. Like, it's not these amazing mirrors. It was like a lot of people might have never even seen a really good mirror in their life. Like, there were small mirrors and they were made out of metals and bronze. And so you would see maybe part of your face, but many not like a perfect mirror. So it's like when you put that in context, and man, I get what Paul's saying. He's saying, I see through a mirror dimly, because we are looking at all those mirrors. Because now we know in part. But one day we will know fully just as we have been fully known. I hope you know that you are fully known and that you are fully loved. And when Christ went to the cross, somehow it counted for you. Somehow it counted for me. Would we bring that message to the world, even though we don't know the ripple effects? We don't know what is going to happen, but we know we serve a really, really big God, and our God didn't stop showing up 2,000 years ago. He's just as at work today, and I believe when we show up in caring for people, he's also going to show up. And when we show up, not just be caring people, but be called people that are answering the call of the Great Commission. I like to just call it the Great Mission. But what if that was our mission? What would the moment be like one day of the ripple effects of how God uses you, even though you don't see the full picture, but you trust God? What will the moment be like one day for you when you get to meet that family, that man, that woman, that boy or girl that you had an impact on? I can only imagine how special it will be for you. Because I know how special it was for this family. I know how special it was for this man. One of the greatest moments of their life. I only imagine what it will be like for you because you said yes to the call. Heaven will be changed. Heaven will be altered. Lives will be changed. And what an opportunity we have to bring the greatest change, the greatest message, the greatest trade to hurting people around the world so they could know how loved they are. Would we truly bring this message to the world? Because it's our choice. God bless you guys, and thank you for having me.